get you closest to them.
Perfect. Okay.
Oh, I love the shoes. Oh, my favorite color, orange.
Mine too. Hi, stranger. How are you? Good.
Good evening. Prior to us coming back to order, I'd like to refer anybody who needs translator services to Miss Valbuena at the podium. Is Miss Valbuena here? Oh,
Hi.
you're right behind me. Thank you.
Buenas tardes, habla Paula Valbuena. Si necesita servicios de interpretación al español, por favor llame al 1805-324-7680 e ingrese el código de acceso 920-050-406 más la tecla numeral. Este es un número totalmente gratuito. Nuevamente, llame al número de teléfono 1805-324-7680 e ingrese el código de acceso 920-050-406 más la tecla numeral. También puede acceder a estas instrucciones en nuestro sitio web en mcs4kids.com, dirigiéndose a la parte inferior en la página en Quick Links y haciendo clic en Board Agendas para ir a la agenda de esta noche. Thank you.
Thank you, Miss Valbuena. Welcome to the Modesto City Schools Special Board Meeting of October 4th, 2021. This meeting is now called to order. No action was taken during closed session, and we will begin by roll call. Trustee Brown?
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Irvin?
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Maestas?
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Marks?
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Mejia?
Present.
Thank you. Vice President Lopez will be joining us soon, and President West is here. Good evening, everyone. This special open session board meeting of the Board of Trustees is being live streamed at the direction of the board. The live stream is available on the district's website, and the recordings will be available for viewing the day after the board meeting. Modesto City School Board meetings have been adjusted to follow health and safety precautions until further notice. Modesto City Schools has provided an opportunity for the public to provide comments. It is outlined in the agenda. The public has been given an opportunity to call in and leave a voicemail, send us a comment via email, or appear in person before the board. Any public comments received via email or voicemail prior to noon, the day of the board meeting, will not be read aloud, but they have been transcribed and printed with copies provided to each board member prior to the start of the board meeting, and they are available to the public. The voice and email public comments will be attached to future board meeting minutes for approval. This practice will continue until further notice. For members of the public that are interested in commenting in the future, we welcome your comments. Do we have any members of the public wishing to speak? We will actually first do the Pledge of Allegiance tonight. If any members of the public do wish to speak tonight on subjects which are not on the agenda, you must complete a public presentation request card and submit it to the board president prior to the period for public comment. The cards are in the lobby, and you can hand your card to Ms. Chambers, who is right behind me this evening. If you plan to speak on a topic, please fill out the card now, as no cards will be accepted after the period for public comment has begun. The maximum time for any one speaker is 3 minutes for a total of 30 minutes. Now, we will please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. You may be seated. So this takes us to our period for public presentation. I have received no cards. Is there anyone who wishes to speak tonight for public presentation? Seeing none. We will begin with this evening's workshop. Item B1, which is a report on ESSER expenditure plan draft, and this will be Mr. Hurst.
Okay, thank you very much, President West, Board of Trustees, Superintendent Gucci, and Cabinet. Again, my name is Steve Hurst. I'm Director of State and Federal Programs, and here to give you a report on the ESSER 3 expenditure plan. And if I hit this right. So, purpose of today's presentation is to give an overview and a background of the ESSER 3 plan, review the input and the feedback that we've received from our educational partners, look at a summary of the expenditure plan which has been submitted, and then go over the next steps in the completion of the plan. So as you can see, the plan does align with all of our district goals, and this isn't surprising because we've aligned most of everything we're doing right now with our district goals, and this is in keeping with that and making sure that it does support what we're trying to achieve. So the American Rescue Act plan, or ARP, was passed by Congress in response to the COVID-19, the novel coronavirus. This is the third of the stimulus packages that have been passed by Congress. The first one, which is affectionately known as the CARES Act, was passed in March of 2020, and the CRRSA, or CRRSA, was passed in December of 2020. So this then is the third act by Congress to provide support to educational agencies. So the funds that have been allocated through the ARP Act does require that this is spent to support students' academic, social, emotional, and mental health needs, as well as addressing the opportunity gaps that existed before and were increased by the COVID-19 pandemic. All of the funds that are associated with this plan do have a 3-year obligation to be spent within, so that means we need to spend them by the year of 2024. So the expenditure plan timeline that we're been given by CDE has that the Board of Education must approve the plan at a public meeting by October 29th, 2021. We will be bringing this plan back for approval at the next meeting. And that once the plan's approved by the board, it is required that it is submitted to our County Office of Education for review, for compliance, and then if everything's in good standing, they'll submit it to the California Department of Education for their review. So the expenditure plan has 4 different sections that are associated with it. The first part is the summary of the planned expenditures and how we're, basically an overview of how we're spending the money. It does require community engagement, so there's a whole section on that. The big part of the plan is the actions and expenditures to address student needs. There are 3 different sections within that part of the plan. And then the fourth part is really making sure that our interventions are addressing our student needs, or think of monitoring and how are we going to make sure the plan's doing what we want it to do. So when you look at community engagement, this the wording up there is it must have meaningful consultation with the community. And if you look at this is something that we've been engaged with over the last year and a half consistently with our community partners. If you think about all the different feedback and input that we've received, not only the development of the LCAP, but the Expanded Learning Opportunities Grant, and even can go further back to that, to some of the plans. So we've had a lot of input into this. Additionally, for this particular plan, we did reach out to our community partners, and cabinet members engaged with a number of them that are listed up there, just to find out and get their input in smaller sessions. Key communicators, we went to the South Modesto Partnership, for example, and we asked, what are we doing well, what's working in what we're doing, as well as what are your thoughts and ideas on what we should be using these funds for. So you can see there's a number of them listed there. We also engaged our students and our parents in this. We worked with Hanover Research on a survey specifically to the ESSER 3, and it was sent out to all of our students, staff, and families seeking input. It was available on our MCS website in both English and Spanish, and we did have over 1,200 responses to that survey where they answered all of the questions on it. We had more responses, but some people didn't answer every question that was on the survey. Of the 1,200, we did have over 800 of those came from our parents, and we had about 100 of those that came in on the Spanish response form. Common themes expressed were increased mental health services, increased academic support for students, increased opportunities for participation in after-school and enrichment activities, and a strong safety procedures being in place related to COVID-19. From the district standpoint, positives that we were seeing is that there has been, we are being received positively in our communication efforts with the community in keeping them abreast of what we're doing and how we're dealing with the COVID-19. But at the same time, there was also still a need expressed that they'd like to see even more communication on that. When we look at the next section of the plan, it is the actions and expenditures. Again, there are these 3 sections to it. There's strategies for continuous and safe in-person learning. There's addressing the impact of lost instructional time. And then if there's funds that are remaining after we've addressed those 2, how are we using those funds? So when you look at the strategies for continuous and safe in-person learning, these strategies must be consistent with the most current CDC and California Department of Health in-person instruction guidance. We can reference other plans, so think of if we have something in our LCAP or the Expanded Learning Opportunities Grant that we've already put in place, we can reference that, but we need to be talking about how we're supplementing those actions for that plan, and we definitely have looked at that. If you go back to May of 2021, really that's where we started talking about how do we change and really image the schools, and this is just a continuation of that concept really for us. For the addressing the lost instructional time, this is the one section that does have a minimum requirement. It does require that 20% of the allocation be sent minimally to address the academic impact of lost instructional time, and that any actions that we implement must be evidence-based interventions, and there's some examples that are straight out of their directions, which is things like summer learning or enrichment, extended day, extended year, comprehensive after-school programs, but anything that there is a proven evidence base to it is something that we could implement and definitely is what we followed in our plan. The remaining use of funds, as you can see on the slide, there's a huge number of different categories that as long as it is consistent with the guidance, and all of these different things are guidance that support this plan, then you can utilize that money. So things that are responding to the COVID-19 response would be an area supporting the needs of our homeless and foster youth, our migrant youth, our English learners. After-school learning is a big one. Mental health is another big one that's on there. But anything that is on this slide or under these activities could be considered, and that includes things that we do with our facilities and our infrastructure related to technology. So the big piece of this also is they want to make sure that whatever we do is working. So each action that is included in the ESSER 3 expenditure plan must be monitored for effectiveness. We need to say how it's going to be monitored and how often it's going to be monitored and reviewed to make sure that it actually is doing what we want it to do. So kind of looking at our plan at this point, all the rest of that was kind of just what has to be in this plan. If you take a look at our strategies for continuous and in-person instruction, big things on there is we want to support our students that aren't ready to come back to school for various reasons, but we need to make sure that. So there's been a big support with MBA that is part of this plan over and above what we already had planned because there's been such an interest in that. Obviously, bringing students back to school, we need to have that COVID testing, monitoring, and everything related to that, and that is a huge expenditure, not only in the costs that are associated with just buying items, but the oversight and everything that goes with that. For the elementary, some more support for supervision, especially like before and after school, and then definitely the before and after school care that we've already proposed out there and expanding and making sure we can continue that past the expiration of the Expanded Learning Opportunities Grant. Looking at the area that we have to put 20% in, which is addressing the impact of lost instructional time. Again, these strategies and things that you see here really are not new in the sense that I'm not putting something new on here. These are expansions of what we know works or we need to make sure that we can even grow greater or continue. So when you see MTSS expansion, when you see student assistance specialists to support the mental health of our students, inclusion to make sure we're looking at our special education students. Those really are not new, but they are areas that we need to make sure that we continue to address to support our students. So this is one of the biggest areas, again, looking at it. So, you know, we want to make sure we're supporting our English learners. You'll see ALD increased staffing. Remediation and intervention, we've had a lot of plans for that, but we want to make sure that they are able to continue. Supporting ACES after school, more STEAM opportunities, those enrichment opportunities. So these are all areas addressing that impact of lost instructional time that have been included in the plan. For the remaining use of funds, again, it goes back to that slide that had all those different kind of categories you can look at, but obviously there's COVID oversight. We want to make sure that we have that equity and intervention that we've been working on diligently in the district, making sure we continue to support that. There's quite a bit of money allocated in technology and facilities specifically, because those are things that we need to do, one, to make sure that students are accessing and the staff has the support that they need using technology, as well as we do need some facility improvements, things like, you know, new HVAC units that meet the air purification standards that we need to have in place now. We're also supporting our nutritional services. You can see the wonderful job they've been doing in serving our staff, but they need additional support to make sure that that happens and can continue on. And we need some fiscal support. We have a lot of money that is being spent. We need to make sure we spend it where we're supposed to spend it and we monitor that it's being spent effectively. So those are all areas that you'll see there in the remaining use of funds. So as you can see, between both districts, we have approximately $80 million in ESSER 3 funds that have been allocated. Each district does have its own plan. There's over $47 million in elementary and over $33 million in the high school district. It's broken down into the three broad categories there, so you can kind of see how that goes depending on the district where the money has flowed to. So as we look forward to this, the next steps of it is obviously this we want to bring back on the 18th to the board for approval. We'll continue to gather input and adjust the plan as necessary based on that input. Once the plan's approved, it does need to go to the County Office of Education for review and then submission to the Department of Education. And then once the plan's been approved, really then it becomes the implementation and monitoring piece. Many of these pieces are already in implementation stage because they will be continued through this plan past the 1 year that maybe they originally were going to be planned for. And so with that, I would ask if there is input or feedback that I could get from the board to help, again, with the finalization of this plan moving forward, because we've kind of sought a lot of input from everybody else, but haven't asked you guys for your opinion or your thoughts yet.
So Trustee Marks?
All right, thank you. So I had a couple of thoughts that I wanted to suggest. So one is, I know it's been very difficult for teachers to be able to do dual teaching from home, I mean from their classroom to the home and with the students, and then at this phase trying to check in with the students with the new changes in the law. So I wanted to ask about technology that they could teach as they normally do in the classroom, and the technology would make it easier for them. So they could, so I happened to think of this while you were sharing the report. A few years ago, I saw one in Alaska. So Alaska had a really difficult time, or has a difficult time, teaching students from home. So they started early on with technology because a lot of their students have to fly on airplanes to get to school every day. So sometimes the weather isn't good. So when I was on the National School Boards Association on the Pacific region, we had a meeting and we wanted to find out how they educated their students. And one of the technology ideas that they were using was taking an iPad, and it was actually on a mobile unit, and it had a little stand that it rolled on with 4 wheels, and it would just follow the teacher around the classroom. And that way the students that were at home could see the teacher, could hear what was going on, could see what was going on, and if they needed to, they could interact. At this point in the COVID, with a lot of students being home, I don't think it's wise or easy for students to communicate with a teacher in the classroom, but to be able to have the technology to be able for the teacher to make it easier for them to be able to teach from their classroom to the students. Let's just say a quarter of their students are home. Let's say you have, we'll just make it easy, or a third of them. So let's say you have 30 students and you have 10 at home, and they need to receive instruction somehow. So rather than making it more cumbersome for the teacher, I think it would make it less cumbersome, so they can log into their computer. Hopefully they're feeling well enough that they can do that from home, and then be able to participate or at least watch what the teacher is teaching that day in the classroom. So that was one idea. It's expensive, yes, but at this point I think it would be helpful, and it might be nice to hear from the teachers and what they think, and how that might be used. And then I had another idea. Oh, the other one was, I didn't see on here, even though we have ACEs, but I was learning about some after school programs, supporting more after school programs for parents, so that students that might have gotten behind in their studies and their homework, that they might be able to have actually more support at home, at the school site after school. So maybe another hour or 90 minutes. I don't know how many students are in the ACEs program, but I thought it might be helpful if we could increase that, and STEM it might be a STEM program after school, but whatever will help the students be engaged and have more time to make up what they didn't have for the last couple of years. So those are a couple of ideas that I had.
Thank you.
Thank you. Trustee Brown, and then Trustee Maestas.
So I have a question about the timeline. We have to adopt a plan by the 29th of October, and I would like to know what room we have for refinement of that plan. This plan has to cover 3 years, and there will be some great ideas that emerge between now and the end of 3 years from now. What ability will we have to refine and adapt to meet other ideas as they emerge?
So the plan obviously does go for approval initially. From there, if there is revisions that we as a district decide need to be made, we essentially just bring it back to the board with those. It does not have to go back to the state once the initial approval has been granted. It is then local education decision on what revisions, if any, or have decided to be made. And I think that that's wise, just because there's things that we may plan right now, things change, we need to do something different, or we thought this was going to be the full cost. It may be less, it may be more. I think we understand that when you're budgeting. And so they've left it to the local level for us to make those adjustments. It just needs to be brought to the board at that point in time.
Trustee Maestas?
Thank you. On this, I have a question. On the slide, one of the slides that said addressing lost instructional time, there was a piece here that said actions must be evidence-based interventions.
Correct.
My question, that term evidence-based gets thrown around a lot, and I just want to know who's deciding what evidence-based interventions are the ones that are allowed. Is that going to be based on what we do and the data that we work for our kids here, or evidence that programs that have worked other places?
Yeah, so
A little bit more on
within the guidelines, there are like 4 levels of evidence-based interventions. What have the research piece behind it to show that it actually affects kids? An example being that they have in there is extended days. There's research that shows that extended days, kids having more time in school, does affect their academic performance and increase academic performance. And so, yes, it is the district's decision on the interventions that we're choosing to implement, but we can't just pick something off the wall and say this is we're going to go with it. We need to have validity, just like we do with anything that we adopt, for why we're adopting it and how it would affect our students. So one of the interventions that's in here is the mental health piece, increasing the students' assistance support. We know that by providing mental health support to students, they're better able to access their education, to perform academically in a better vein than if that was not addressed. There's evidence that already shows that would be an evidence-based intervention.
Trustee Maestas, I would like to add, thank you, Mr. Hurst. I'd like to add something else to that. So part of what we're doing here is we're adding a lot into the system. These dollars are not ongoing. They're only ongoing till 2024. So if you can remember back to when we were in this room roughly 8 months ago when we were doing my evaluation, I talked about this structure called summits, meaning all of the district office staff each had 3 goals and they shared them with their group of 4, and it's ongoing and we're monitoring. Everything that we're putting into the system that is substantive in nature as far as dollars, it's owned by a particular either senior director or cabinet level. The reason for this is, one, we can monitor it this year, and if it's not working, we need to look to see what we can do to tweak it or not, and then either decide to move it forward or not. And so by the end of that 3 years, by December 2023, we want to be able to identify those programs that are working as evidenced by the data or are not working, and then we move those out. Additionally, we have some programs that aren't outlined through ESSERS that potentially would also be discontinued to be able to support some of the things that we're adding in. So you're going to see that in May or April when I come back through my evaluation process. You're going to see where folks are with each of the big big programs, the ones that are in the millions that we've added through either the ELO dollars. So it sounds like this is the first time you guys have added your input. It really isn't. Actually, back May 10th, we had a board meeting and we brought forward, I think it was like $25 million worth of ELO dollars, extended learning dollars. These ESSERS, the extended learning dollars is only 1 year. ESSERS are now taking it 2 and 3 years. So you actually did provide input back in May as to other programs that you wanted to see. So it's just a continuation of the ELO in addition to others. So hopefully that answers the really what's evidence-based and how are we monitoring it. So there is a structure in place for monitoring that, and you all will see that when we come back through my evaluation process.
Yes. Trustee Mejia?
Yeah, I just want to echo some of the sentiments about checking, because sometimes as we're kind of seeing every month, things are going to change, and I know certain students are going to probably be more impacted. So being able, if it's flexible enough to revise it and revisit it, I think is super important. And I definitely want us to keep a close eye on some of those, because I know as our kids are going to school and struggling and going through things, we're going to discover there's some things that work and some that don't. So I just want to be sure that we're open. So I just want to echo our two board members that brought that up, that we're flexible. And thank you for all your work in putting the plan together and a quick turnaround time.
See no further hands. I just had one question. We see all over these days staffing shortages, and we have money to provide these programs, which is awesome. But what are we doing to address our ability to actually fill the positions that we need to fill?
Great question.
Mr. Henderson can probably answer that better than I, but I will tell you that there is a provision there to support some additional HR staffing needed to make sure that we are meeting those needs that we have with these plans. But he can probably give you a much better information than I.
I think we're keeping up as best as possible, competing out there with everyone else. But we have put some incentives in place to try and entice. You've probably seen that out in the field, not only kind of joining the ranks of even some private industry folks, but hiring incentives, which is a bit of a first, at least in my memory, to try and put that out there, and some of the paraprofessional incentives, for example, that's a significant amount for someone to come in and make a commitment to that level of time in the district. And so it's early on, but we're watching, monitoring to see if that's resulting in an uptick. Also, just using different means to try and recruit and get the word out. This past weekend, we had a partnership with MJC, and it's through the classes there. You may know Vicki Trask. She's someone who's very well known in our education circles, but we're partnering with her through special education, and we did an on-site one-stop shop paraprofessional sort of recruitment boot camp, and kind of assessing how that went and how we could duplicate that effort over time. So we're exploring different means to expand our reach and compete.
That's awesome. I think we just need to continue to be creative in that. And I apologize, I should have gone first out to the public to see if the public had any comments. I see no public here. Thank you so much for the great report. And we will be moving on now to item B2, which is our report on facilities update, and that will be Mr. Zierli.
Thank you, President West. Good evening, trustees. And thank you for the time at the workshop to give us an opportunity to provide the board with a facility update for our district, and in particular, an update on a recent bond measure feasibility survey that was completed for our high school district. Joining us tonight, we have individuals that some of you are familiar with. They were part of the Successful Measures D&E program. We have Charles Heath with TBWBH. We have Brian Godby with Godby Research. Kathy Domenico with Capital Public Finance Group. And to my left, we have Jeff Small, also with Capital Public Finance Group. This was the team that was put together back in 2017 to help the elementary district formulate a bond program that turned into Measures D&E. And now we are investigating the possibility of a similar measure for the high school district. When we're done with the presentation and board questions on the feasibility survey, we do have an activity for the board set up where you'll have an opportunity to provide your input in the form of spending your dollars. How would you spend your money in certain priority areas? And I know Trustee Brown and Trustee Marks, I'm not sure if President West was here back in 2017. You were. So it's similar to what we did for Measures D&E. You'll have some boxes we'll spread out throughout the room with some different areas of facility improvements, and then we'll just give you the opportunity, much like we just did with the ESSER plan, where you were able to provide input. You'll be able to provide input in how would you spend your dollars, and then we'll take the boxes and then we'll record the different dollar amounts that were placed in there. We'll compare that to what's the voters' priorities, and that'll help us craft in the event we move forward, craft the language for the bond measure next year. Before I turn it over to Charles Heath and Brian Godby, just briefly, the survey showed us that indeed a high school bond measure is a viable option, but there is some assumptions there, and one of the assumptions is a positive communication outreach is needed over the next several months, if indeed we do decide to move forward with a bond election next November. So with that, I'm pleased to have again Charles Heath and Brian Godby, and they will update the board on the survey and the survey results.
Great. Thank you, Tim. This is Brian Godby. I think I'll dive in. Charles has some slides later on in the presentation. And I will give you sort of page numbers as we go through this, make sure we're on the same page. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you tonight about the survey results. We're happy to have done another project for you. If we can move on to page 2, this is the one that says Overview and Research Objectives. So, as you know, the survey was designed to cover off on a variety of different areas. First, we wanted to look and see how the district was faring in terms of its COVID efforts compared to the state and the county. We've been doing that with virtually all of our clients since the beginning of the crisis back in March of last year. We obviously are looking at what people think about the district separate of the crisis in terms of quality of education and spending of taxpayer dollars. There's a direct assessment of a bond measure, and you'll see that in a few moments. We also look at informational statements, as Tim alluded to. And then there are, of course, a wide variety of demographic and behavioral characteristics that we use to validate the sample to make sure that it is representative of the community. We can move on to slide 3, methodology overview. The universe that we surveyed was likely November 2022 voters, when this is most likely to be on the ballot. It could also be on the June primary ballot too, but our analysis suggests that November is better. We were in the field in late September. The average survey was 25 minutes long. We did 801 interviews, which is a little better than we had hoped for. We were looking for a minimum of 700, and because of our online methodology, we were able to exceed that, which helps us with the margin of error. You can see how the data collection was broken down by landline, cell phone, text invitation to the online survey, and email invitation to the online survey. There are no just links on Facebook or things like that. You have to actually get an email or a text invitation from us to participate, so we're controlling the sample based on the likely voter universe. All of that methodology gives us a margin of error of plus or minus 3.45% overall, which is actually quite good, and a little higher than the academy counts. So moving on to slide 5, this one says favorability rating of how agencies are addressing coronavirus. And this was a pretty straightforward favorability question. We asked, do you have a very favorable, somewhat unfavorable, very unfavorable view of the state of California, Stanislaus County, or Modesto City Schools? And as you can see from the first boxes above the bar, those boxes represent the very favorable and somewhat favorable added up. The state's 51% favorable, the county's at 44, and the district is at 45. But there's an important caveat to that. You can see that the gray bar on the far right-hand side of the slide is smaller for the state and larger for the school district. That's because a larger chunk of people in the school district don't have an opinion, and they tell us that. And so the ratio of positive to negative is actually much better for the school district than the county, and slightly better for the school district than the state. So the state's 1.27 to 1, positive to negative. The county is 0.97 to 1, so a little bit underwater, and the school district is 1.3 to 1. So that's actually pretty good. This helps us deal with the fact that that's obviously the biggest issue confronting us right now. It also provides us crosstabs so we can look at how people view the district on this dimension versus a potential bond measure. So that's part of our more detailed analysis. Moving on to page 6, this is satisfaction with the job Modesto City Schools is doing to provide a quality education. This is similar. It's very satisfied, somewhat satisfied. Same thing on the negative side. If you add the satisfaction and the dissatisfaction together, you'll see we're at 57% in round numbers satisfied versus 31% dissatisfied. That's a positive to negative ratio of 1.84 to 1. That's a pretty good place to be for a measure that we're talking about that requires a 55% majority. We've seen districts pass these measures with somewhat lower ratios. We don't want to be lower, obviously, but we have seen that in the past. Next slide, 7, please. Satisfaction with district management of public funds. Same thing here. This almost always goes down. And the reason it goes down is because there is a larger chunk of people who don't have an opinion. They just don't follow your budget. And that's not surprising. They're being honest about it. In this case, when we add the variance summits together, we see we're at 46% satisfied versus 33% satisfied. The ratio is 1.39 to 1. Again, that's not a bad place to be. We've seen districts be successful with even 2/3 parcel taxes as low as 0.9 to 1, which is a little bit upside down. So people are reasonably happy with where you're at from a financial perspective. Next question, this is slide 8, and it's titled Opinion on Whether Your District Needs Additional Funds. We asked them, do they agree or disagree with the statement the district needs additional funds to do its job to educate students? And you can see here when you add the strongly and somewhat agree together that 63% agree that you need additional funding versus just 29% that disagree with that. That's a positive to negative ratio of 2.19 to 1. So that's the best ratio we've seen of all of these. So that's, I think, a pretty good indication that people are open to the idea of additional funding for this. On the next page, uninformed support for a bond measure. This is where we actually ask the ballot question, and you see that in the box on the right-hand side of the slide. It is a 75-word ballot statement. It meets all the legal requirements for the state of California to place a measure on the ballot, Prop 39 bond measure, such as this is, and that requires a 75-word limit. It requires the total amount of bonds, which is in this case $198 million. It requires a legal rates statement, how much it raises annually, which would be $9.7 million approximately. What the tax rate would be, that's 2.9 cents per $100 of assessed value. And basically the rest of the words are ours to identify the projects, and so that's what the bullets that you see at the top of the statement are. This, as I said earlier, needs 55% to be successful, and this is not a bad place to start at 56%, but with a 3.5% margin of error, we could be a little bit below 55%. We could be a little higher than where we are here. We're sort of right on the bubble, and again, they don't know a lot about the measure other than the 75-word statement. So as we move forward, we want to see if we provide information that goes up. Moving to the next slide, this is Informational Statements 1. This is the first slide of a long list of items that are information-based. They're facts about the measure that the voters might be interested in knowing before they make a decision. We provide each of these in a random order and ask them if you're much more likely, somewhat more likely, or does this measure have no effect on your vote? And then when we're done with all of the interviewing, we go back and we assign numeric values to each of those responses. So much more likely gets a 2, a somewhat more likely gets a 1, but no effect gets a 0. And that gives us a scale of high of 2. If everybody were to say they were to a low of 0 if everybody were to say they had no effect on their vote. And it gives us the ability to create a very nuanced ranking of how they compare with each other. The reason we do this is pretty simple. You could have an item that is 40% much more likely and 20% somewhat more likely, that's 60. And you could have the reverse stuff, where it was 20% much more likely and 40% somewhat more likely, that's still 60%, but in this case, it's a much different 60% than the first one. So that bias that is built into just adding the percentages together is eliminated by using this ranking. Now, the ranking is somewhat abstract, so we still use the percentages, and that's what the blue arrow indicates. We also look at statistical groupings, and what that means is that they're within that margin of error that we talked about earlier. And the good news from just this table's perspective is that everything on the first slide is in tier 1, so it's our top group of arguments. They're again technically tied. They range from 77% in round numbers down to 69%, which again with that margin of error that we were talking about, 3.5%, you can see that's within the margin. And they're all pretty good items. Every penny from the measure will benefit local schools, be controlled locally, and the magic words cannot be taken by the state. That text at the top of the list almost in every school district in the state. Measure requires independent citizens oversight is number 2, so another accountability provision. None of the money from the measure can be used to increase salaries, benefits, or pensions for administrators. Yet a third accountability measure, so those are really important to voters. The measure updates classroom technology and science labs to prepare students to compete in college and careers in today's competitive global environment. So sort of a STEM argument. This measure will support 21st century learning so students can graduate with skills necessary to be competitive in the job market. Similar kind of argument. Measure will complete the basic repairs needed to keep school buildings safe and functioning. And then finally on this slide, the measure will upgrade classrooms and educational facilities to support core academic instruction in math, science, reading, and writing. So a little broader than just the STEM argument, but still testing very near the top. And again, statistically, these are all high. If you go to the next slide, this is the remainder of the informational statements that we tested. Most of them are in tier 1 as well from a statistical perspective. You can see we go down to just about 68%. So they're all pretty good. You know, at the end of the day, there's limited time to communicate everything. So I would say at the top tier, the top of the top tier, and these are important, no question, but they're just not as important to the average vote. And there may be segments within that some of these, there's a different ordering, but when we're thinking about the voters as a whole, this is the best order. And in deference to your time, I won't read all of these, but you can see what they are. So after providing all that additional information, which allows us to create the ranking that you've seen, we come back to the next slide, number 12, which is our ballot question. It's the exact same wording that we asked before. This one's titled Post-Information Support for the Bond Measure. And you can see we go from 56, where we're sort of sitting on the bubble, up to 66. So we've got almost a 10-point jump in round numbers once people begin to hear information. So that's a really good and encouraging sign, but it does come with a caveat. It's the one that Kim mentioned earlier, is that there is work to be done. In the survey, people heard the information. The average voter has not yet, and it's our job to do the work, the hard work, to get that message out to them so they know what the details of the measure are, just like we did in the survey. So if we go to the next slide, this is number 13, and it's summary and recommendations. Clearly there is a solid base of support after respondents get that information about the measure. We go from 56 to 66, as I said. The top arguments are the ones that I identified. The money will be controlled locally and can't be taken by the state, citizens oversight, and none of the money can be used for administrator salaries. So those accountability themes are really strong, and then the STEM and core academic themes as well. And so clearly voters want that additional information from the district before a measure is placed on the ballot. But if we do that, should consider placing a measure on the ballot. So that's the end of the survey portion. I'm either happy to answer questions now or let Charles go through his slides and then we can answer questions together at the end. Your choice.
I'd like to stop for questions right now, if that's all right, because it looks like we're going to be going over some different information in the next step. So I'm going to go first to members of the public, if we have any public here, which it looks like we do not. And then anyone from the board, do we have questions on this part at this point? Excuse me? Oh, Trustee Irvin?
Yes. And looking at and looking at the informational on this, it leaves off is athletic facilities authorized in here. I didn't see those.
Yeah, we do have, I'm sorry, go ahead. We do have additional analysis to do, which includes athletic facilities as well. They don't test as well as the STEM stuff does.
Yeah, there, Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, and Charles, there were more than 2 slides of items. There would have been much more. Athletics were part of that survey, but it's not on one of these 2 slides. It would be on a.
No, and it didn't test as well as the science, technology, engineering, and math kinds of topics.
Academic projects and programmings tended to outperform sort of extracurricular projects, the general trend.
That's
okay.
That is interesting.
Yeah.
If I see no other hands, I just had one comment on this. I remember with our bonds D and E, it was brought to our attention, and I'm not, probably Trustee Brown can expand on this more, but we were able to save so much money in interest, and by shortening the time of those bonds, we were so careful and fiscally responsible with those funds that we ended up saving a lot of money on those bonds, if I'm correct. And so I think that information would be really important to get out to the public, to let them know with these other bonds, we were able to be so wise with how we spent that money that we were able to save a lot of money. I just think it would, people who were voting, I think, would feel a lot more trust knowing that we were being very careful about how we were spending this money. And seeing no more hands, thank you for that part of the report, and we're ready to move on for the next part.
Before we could leave the survey topic, Brian, I know you did some analysis of the support levels and potentially putting a measure on the June primary election, which was expected to be slightly lower voter turnout compared to a higher turnout general election. You alluded to your recommendation for November versus June, but maybe you want to expand upon that so folks understand the rationale.
Yeah, sure. And the point is an important one. When we look at that second test that we talked about, where we were 66% in round numbers in November, we were only 57% in June. So with the margin of error, June still is sitting on the bubble. So while we may want to go sooner, there's probably a longer runway that we need to employ to have more time to be able to provide the information that people want. And even still, it's just because of the smaller universe, meaning an older voter universe, for the most part, it's just going to be harder in June. And I think we can maximize our success rate by going into November, both in terms of the length of the runway and the time to communicate, as well as communicating to a broader audience.
Thank you for clarifying that. Thank you. And moving on to the next part of this presentation.
Okay, yeah, that's my part. And Tim, do we have the 2022 bond measure planning timeline slide up?
We do, Charles.
Okay, excellent, thank you. My piece of this is to talk a little bit about the process and the timeline from here if we do want to pursue a November 2022 bond measure like Brian just recommended. And this really follows the process and the strategy that we used for measures D&E back in 2018, and similar process that we've used successfully with hundreds of school districts around the state. The first step of the process, which is what we're talking about tonight, is this feasibility assessment. Doing the polling to check in with voters, see what their priorities are, see what their sensitivity is to a potential bond measure, potential tax rates, and so on and so forth. But also looking at the political landscape and some of the competing issues to understand, what our best options are for moving forward. And tonight we're delivering the recommendation that yes, we do think a bond measure is feasible. But with that important caveat that Brian mentioned, we have some work to do in order to raise awareness in the community of what the facility needs are in your high school district that a bond measure would address. So our next steps would be to begin an outreach and consensus building process like we did for measures D&E, where we're educating and informing the public about your needs, what a bond measure would fund, and what you've accomplished with past bond dollars. While the school district is legally prohibited from advocating for the passage of a bond measure, you can provide impartial information regarding your needs and what a proposed measure would accomplish. And I'll walk through kind of the specifics of what we would envision for that here in a minute. Concurrent to that outreach and consensus building process, we would also be taking what we've learned from the survey research, also what we're learning from any feedback from the community as we conduct that outreach, to then build the resolution, the bond project list, the detailed documentation that would come back to you for approval to put the measure on the ballot. If we're looking to be on the ballot in November of 2022, the district is going to face a deadline right around the 4th of July, it's actually July 6th of next year, to have the bond measure documents finalized and approved by the board, delivered to the county registrar of voters office to get us on the ballot. Then the last step of the process here, which is that green phase in the timeline, which is the advocacy campaign. As I mentioned, public resources, district dollars, district staff time cannot be used to advocate for the passage of the measure. So like we did in 2018, we'll have to have an independent campaign committee formed that can be comprised of teachers and staff and parents, also district staff, but working on their own time as independent citizens, individuals, rather than representatives of the district, raise private resources, recruit volunteers in order to implement a campaign in support of the bond measure. And as Brian said, information has a strong impact on support for this measure. So maximizing what we can do from the district to tell your story about what your facility needs are at your high schools, and then also just before people vote, making sure we have a strong voice advocating for the measure as people are considering their votes in November of next year. Those are going to be important components of success. So if we can go on to the next slide, which is recommended next steps. So I wanted to give you a sense of what that process would look like. So, we've learned a lot from Brian's polling in terms of the projects that people prioritize, the messages that people respond to. So our next step would be to develop and implement an informational communication effort targeting registered voters generally throughout the high school district. Again, telling the story of what your facility needs are and how a bond measure might help address those needs. We would utilize direct mail, but also digital media channels to get that information out. We would use both the districts and your schools' social media presence to help get that messaging out there far and wide. But then we would also look to engage in some informational presentations with key stakeholder groups. Those would both be internal stakeholder groups, your parent organizations, your employee associations, and others, to make sure that the internal audiences are well aware of the facility needs and the plans for potential bond measure. And then also go out to some of the external groups, whether that be elected leaders, business groups like the Chamber of Commerce, and other influential stakeholders in the community, to make sure they understand the needs and the proposal, have an opportunity to provide input as well. And if we go to the next slide, this is a continuation of the recommended next steps. We would propose to do that informational outreach, that stakeholder outreach, and then have Brian come back in the spring timeframe to conduct a tracking poll to measure the impact of that informational outreach, make sure that we're realizing the growing support levels as we raise awareness in the community of your needs and of this proposal. And based on that, we would then have confidence to move forward with pulling the trigger to place a measure on the November ballot. And then again, based on what we're hearing from the community, what we're learning from the survey research, we would develop the resolution calling the election and the specific language of the measure, the 75-word ballot question, the qualifying project list, the tax rate statement. Those are all the pieces that either appear on voters' ballots or are reprinted in the voter pamphlet that's available to voters. So, making sure that all that language is optimized and in line with voter priorities is really, really key. And then moving to the next slide here, this is sort of the final steps in the process. So we would be looking at a June board meeting target date for bringing that resolution to you for adoption with the finalized project list and ballot language. That is so that we beat that July 6th deadline to submit a board adopted resolution to the County Registrar of Voters to qualify for the ballot. Once those steps have occurred, we would implement a final phase of informational outreach to announce the board's action to place the measure on the ballot, make sure people understand what they'll be voting on in November, and they understand how to vote in this election. And then that would wrap up the district's role in the process of creating the measure and informing the public on a factual basis. And then we would transition in the summer months, starting in the July-August timeframe, to that independent advocacy campaign. And that's where private citizens, other advocates from schools, parents, principals, teachers, others would come together to mount that advocacy campaign. So that's my summary of the process and timeline from here. I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you. Sorry, just finishing my notes. Do we have any members of the public wishing to comment? Seeing none. Trustee Brown?
You can go. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I'm excited to see that we have positive numbers that will lead us in the direction of doing this. And, I have kind of mixed feelings on this one. When we started out going after Measures D and E, we had our billion-dollar book and very little positive work that we'd been able to do to kind of tackle those numbers. But since then, we've seen great progress. And since we've had money to allocate to the elementary projects, that's freed up other money that's allowed us to do some of the most visible things at our high school campuses. And so I'm a little bit worried because the public sees that we are doing good things already with those schools. Where before we didn't have money and we weren't accomplishing what needed to happen at the elementary schools. So there's great things happening, and I think that, like has been said, we've got to get our message clear, and we have to be really working hard early and fast to make sure that the public knows where our needs are, because they're not quite as visible this time. And then the other thing that I want to ask, Charles, you know how hard we worked to get a committee together and how effective that committee was last time. I felt like we got a late start. What would be the best time for us to be putting that committee together? Do we have to wait for any of these triggers to make it official, or should we be starting now to put together the players?
Yeah, I think we can absolutely start immediately to lay the groundwork. There's enough evidence here to suggest that, we're likely to be having a bond election next year. So I think, engaging with some of those key supporters could be some of the same people from Measures D and E. It could be a broader group now that we're bringing in your other elementary feeder districts to start identifying folks that would be willing to participate on that committee, trying to identify potential endorsers, potential donors to the campaign. there's nothing prohibiting us from starting that process early. I think that, as we get closer to having the details of a measure ironed out, it'll be easier to recruit folks, because at this point there's a lot of kind of open questions about exactly what a measure might look like. And we probably won't have good answers to those questions for a few months here as the planning process develops. But certainly by the spring, around that time in my timeline where I was talking about moving the tracking pole and using that to finalize the measure language, I think by that point we certainly should be able to start recruiting and forming that committee, so there's a smooth transition from the district planning effort to that advocacy campaign in the summer months.
So
Thank
just
you.
for perspective, if I may, back in, it was December of 2017, when we had this workshop with the board in planning for a potential November of 2018 bond election. So we are 2 to 3 months ahead of that schedule. This time, Trustee Brown, and hopefully that urgency does not feel the same with the advanced planning that we have going on at the moment.
Trustee Marks and then Trustee Urban.
Great comments and understanding of where we are right now with the timing of all of this. So thank you, and thank you, Trustee Brown, because I know you went through a lot last time with the D&E. So that was wonderful that they passed. And then also I wanted to ask on the recommended next steps on the updates to the district's website and social media accounts. I didn't know that we could use that to put information out. I know in the past it's been a conflict for the district, but I didn't know maybe if it's just information. I know we're not telling them what to do, but that's okay. I just didn't want to jeopardize any funding for us in a bond if we violated some law. So that's where I was just concerned.
Yeah, any school district resources, including your website, your social media profile, any communication via those channels has to be strictly informational and non-advocacy. And we utilize those channels for Measures D&E, and we work closely with your bond counsel to have all of the messaging to make sure that it is clearly information and non-advocacy, so that we don't create any risk by utilizing those channels to communicate our messaging.
Awesome.
Yeah, we used the opportunity last time to tell our story. I mean, if you recall, there were pictures taken.
Yeah.
As Trustee Brown pointed out, we've done a lot of things since then, and so it's going to look a little differently. But we also have a fully functional staff communications department now that we did not have at the time we initiated this for Measures D&E. So we will use all avenues we can to tell our story, but we cannot ask for people to vote yes on the measure. That's something we can't do, but we can sure tell our story.
Right. Well, that's good. That helps me understand it a little bit better. So I appreciate that. I just wanted to make sure, because back when we did the first bond in 2001, that one was a big deal. We had to be really careful in how we did it. But yes, I remember us telling our story. And this, when I saw this, I don't know, for right now, I just felt like there was a lot more to it on the district website and the social media. So that you explained it very well. And thank you, Mr. Zerley, too.
Trustee Irvin?
Yes. There we go. 2 questions. One, in comparison to this information and data from the last bond measure that got passed, how is the data here in relation to that? How are they the same? Are they close?
That was my question, too.
How do they compare?
You want me to take that, Charles, or do you want it?
Yeah, it's a little bit apples to oranges. So in the survey research that we did prior to Measures D&E, we started at a higher level. We started in the mid 70% range, so quite a bit above the 50% mark. But after we introduced additional information, support didn't change much. It kind of stayed hovering in the low to mid 70s. Here, what we see is that we started at a lower level, still above the 55% threshold, but with information we jump up a full 10 percentage points and get up into the mid to high 60s. So support for this measure is a little bit more volatile or movable. And I think this is probably, to Tim's point, you know, when we did the elementary measures, it had been such a long time before really any significant investments had been made in the schools, the need was overwhelming and it was evident, right? And so I think that's why we started with such a high level of support. But because support started high, there wasn't really much room to move up. Here, I think that's why we have a little bit of work to do to tell our story about what the needs are at the high schools, because it's not as obvious and evident as it was at the elementaries. But when we tell that story and people understand it, we see support rise to similar levels.
Yeah, we were at 76% initial support for one of the, I don't know if it was health and safety or the other one, but we were 76%. So there was no need for a follow-up spring survey that Brian Godby talked about earlier, or Charles talked about. We didn't need to do that because we were confident, as Charles just said, even after the messaging, it stayed in the high 70s or in the mid 70s for measures D&E, a little different than this measure.
Okay, and then actually the last one is basically a statement. So now that we're going into the high schools, and part of our messaging should also let the public know that now we're upgrading our elementary schools, and that it's also imperative that we do the same. So our elementary students now want to have state-of-the-art facilities when they go on to high school, that they have the same access to those state-of-the-art facilities that we need to develop for them when they when they eventually get there. It's almost like you change the front two tires, and then the other two tires are still bald, and you don't want to you don't have the money to change them right now, but at the same token you're putting everything at risk because you got those two bald tires. So using that, I don't know, metaphor or analogy, I think it's imperative that we, in our messaging, that we try to, bring that home. It's imperative that our high schools get upgraded as well. I mean, we got two newer high schools, which, people know about, and people try to get there, even if they don't live in the area, to try to get to Grigori and Enox. So we want them to know that all of our high schools have the same type of access and quality education across the board. So I just want to make that statement. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions from the board? Seeing none. Trustee Maestas?
Hello? All right. Thank you. It's just a follow-up from Trustee Irvin. We were at 70, you said around 70% when we tracked that survey. How did the vote come out?
The vote, if I recall, it was in the 72 to 73% success.
Okay.
Both of the measures were very high, very, very close to the initial survey.
So they tracked about the same. Okay. That's all I had.
Yeah, we had two measures on the ballot. Measure D, I think, got about 72%, and Measure E got about 70%.
Thank you. Do we turn this back over to Mr. Zerly? You have an activity for us?
I do. We're going to set it up. What we're going to do is we'll put these boxes that you see here. Let's put them up at the. Let's put them up there, Jeff or Roger, up on the dais. You'll see these boxes here, like a little shoe box. It's got an opening in the top, and you're going to be given $1 million to spend in different denominations. You'll have 4 $100,000 bills, 6 $50,000 bills, 10 $20,000 bills, and 10 $10,000 bills. And so capital projects, and are you handing out the sheet, Jeff? So you'll see here, capital projects have been categorized into the different boxes, and based on the feedback, some of the feedback we saw in the voter survey, but we did not want that to sway the board's priorities. So there's some information we did not share because we did not want. We want to see your priorities as the board. How would you like to to spend your $1 million. Outdated and damaged facilities, and again, these were things that were important. Replacing portables, leaky roofs, HVAC systems, upgrading cafeterias, plumbing, and renovating restrooms. The next box is classroom technology and career technical improvements. The key things here are updating classrooms, science labs. That's, if you recall, in the elementary bond measure, science lab pulled real well. CTE classrooms and labs. These are high school facilities, and so that's a priority too. Learning technology, performing arts theaters, music and art facilities. Improved accessibility, really around ADA accessibility improvements. Health and safety improvements, fire and emergency alarm system, parking lots, campus security, seismic and earthquake safety, and then finally physical education and athletic facilities. Could include new athletic stadiums. We have 4 high schools without stadiums, updating the 3 existing stadiums, replacing our aging pools or a new pool at the high school without a pool, all-weather tracks, and field safety improvements. So take a moment. You can look at the list here, review your denominations, and then put them in the box that you see up on the dais where you normally sit. Any questions on that at the moment before we get started? Okay.
So Tim, when we talk about a spring, going back out in the spring to do some more polling, what month is that? What does that look like?
I don't know if you heard that question, Charles, or not, but we talked about it with our team last week. I think it was. We're looking at May. It would be before the end of the school year.
So it's
middle
other
May.
end of the spring.
Yeah, is that correct, Brian and Charles, to do a follow-up spring survey?
Yeah, so the sort of timeline piece that we have to work around is that, the primary election will occur on June 7th next year. And, roughly the month before that, voters will be considering other issues. So we probably don't want to poll right in the middle of that primary election. So our options are, I think, to be out in front of that in the April timeframe or just after the June primary election. The challenge with that is going to be that means we have a very compressed timeline after the primary election and before that July 6th deadline to qualify for the ballot. So I think probably, that mid to late April timeframe is going to be ideal.
Thank you.
I think Trustee Lopez brought a good question. Any thoughts on it's gonna be all in mail-in ballots? Is that making a difference on any analysis being done? Or are you even considering that as one? Oh, I think Trustee Lopez was. I asked it for him, I think.
Yeah, we had all mail ballot elections in 2020.
Mr. Zerly, when will we hear the results of our money stuffing of the boxes?
So Jeff will be taking the boxes back to his office in Sacramento. So tomorrow we'll figure out what the tabulations are, and then I'll work with the superintendent to see how we want to disperse that information. The goal of this activity was not to see how fast we could spend $7 million, but it was to help us or provide us with guidance for the public outreach that we have in front of us. So we now have what our voters are telling us, and now we have the board priorities, and we know, as Trustee Brown has alluded to, we know what staff priorities are. We know we have that information. So we're going to use those three pots of information to help us craft our public outreach campaign over the next several months. But we'll get that to you as soon as we can.
Okay, thank you. Trustee Brown?
So I know a huge part of this is determining how much we can ask for, and what we put as our dollar amount on the actual bonds. At what point do we determine those numbers and whether or not we're doing one bond or two bond measures like we did the last time?
I'll try to answer that, and I'll see what our campaign strategist has to say. But the survey was and I'm not sure if it was documented here or not, was $198 million. We wanted to keep that. We thought that $200 million amount may throw off some of our support. They hear $200 million. and that's at a rate of $29. So I mean that was our target going into the survey. We could maximize at $30 and get us over 200 million, about 205 million. So that'll be determined, I think, during the next several months. But we saw that the voters have appetite for 198 million at $29. And Charles, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that or not, or Jeff.
I would only add that in the survey, we did test some different tax rates just to see if there was sensitivity to that. We really saw no significant difference in voter support as those tax rates changed. So it really seems that the key factor for the high school measure is making sure people have that information about the need and what a bond would accomplish, more so than the tax rate issues. And I think given that we're now dealing with a larger tax base in the high school area, we can, deliver significant dollars with a single bond measure. The challenge we had with the elementary measure is a single measure just didn't provide enough to make a meaningful impact, which is why we went with two. But that's not necessarily the case as we look at the larger high school district.
Yeah, 4 years ago we were here looking at $60 to $70 million for the elementary district, and which is why this team got creative and said, well, let's try two bond measures. In essence, we doubled that for the $150 million that we have for measures D and E. We're at a much better starting point just because of the assessed value in the high school district is far greater than the elementary district. So we think one bond measure will be sufficient and be in the 200 million, north of the $200 million range when it's ultimately done.
And that's $27 or $29 per 100,000.
$29 per 100,000
$29.
gets us roughly 198 million. That's what we.
Okay.
And as Charles pointed out, there wasn't any significant swaying when we go. The maximum $30 per 100,000 gets us, 205 million. So there wasn't significant difference between the two.
Okay, thank you. Trustee Irvin?
Yes, I really enjoyed, this little game here. I was wondering with the possibility to see if we could do a focus group with students and have them participate and see what their priorities are in this whole scenario here, since they will be the ultimate recipients of this, and see what their input would be, from a student perspective.
Trustee Urban, we've got two student groups that we work closely with. One is Inter-High Council, and the other one is the Superintendent Advisory.
Sure.
And actually, that is later this week, and then the following month. This would be a good activity. As soon as we can get everyone together, I think this one is going to be virtual, and then we're going to bring bring the kids together. I think we could do this activity. How much was each person given?
Each person was given $1 million.
$1 million.
In this activity.
Okay, and so we can mirror that and see what happens. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's another thing about the timing. We have some time, and I think Charles or Brian talked about reaching both internal and external stakeholders. And even though the majority of our high school students are not voting age yet, they are internal stakeholders of ours, and we have time to engage that group and see what they would say.
Yeah. Some of them may be by 2022.
That's right.
It's true.
You never know.
Should be.
Do we have any further questions from the board? See none. Thank you for the fun activity. And thank you for the great presentation, everyone. We'll move on now to a discussion and action item, which is C1. And this is the approval of the MOU between Modesto City Schools and Modesto Teachers Association for the Independent Study Plan COVID-19. Mr. Henderson.
Yes, good evening, President West and trustees and cabinet. Item C1 requests the board's approval of a memorandum of understanding between the district and MTA for implementation of what we're terming Independent Study Plan COVID-19. With the passage of Assembly Bill 130 back in July and the subsequent signing of AB 167 by Governor Newsom just over a week ago on September 23rd. These two bills made changes to address the educational needs of students needing independent study on a short-term basis due to absences caused by or related to COVID illness, exposure, or quarantine. The district and MTA engaged extensively to work out how to implement a plan and many details that had to be considered to meet the needs of students in terms of providing academic work, to meet parents' expectations to continue students' education when they're absent due to quarantine, and to wrap our minds around the significant increase in responsibilities for our certificated staff who will be on the front lines of implementing the plan, and to do it all in a manner compliant with what's defined in those bills. We believe that we've reached a strong balance and the best plan possible, with the focus being on having certificated staff provide the work and support services to the students in their classrooms and on their campuses every day. So when a student is absent to quarantine, the best person to organize, provide, and assess the work is that student's teacher, and to provide the support services for students because of their absences, the staff, certificated staff on the campus. You've had the opportunity to look at the attached MOU. It details the specific work involved for this independent study plan and the compensation that will be provided to certificated staff for the extra duties. The financial impact is listed, and the recommendation, it is recommended that the board approve the MOU between MCS and MTA for Independent Study Plan COVID-19. And a number of us are available if you have questions.
Thank you. Going out to the public first. Seeing no members of the public who may have comments, we will go now to members of the board who have questions or comments. See none. I am looking for a motion to approve the memo of understanding between Modesto City Schools and Modesto Teachers Association for Independent Study Plan COVID-19.
Right.
Okay, moved by Trustee Maestas, seconded by Trustee Irvin. And all in favor signify by raising your hand and saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? See none, it passes unanimously. Thank you.
Thank you.
We are now looking for a motion to adjourn the meeting, moved by Trustee Mejia, seconded by Trustee Maestas. And all in favor signify by saying aye, raising your hand.
Aye.
Any opposed? See none. The motion is, the meeting is adjourned.